study how babies learn words. There are two main reasons. The first is that from a science perspective, it's actually a really hard problem. So on the one hand, you start with a noisy, bustling environment around the baby. All sorts of things are happening. They're hearing a mess of stuff that they don't understand yet, which is usually bad for learning. Then you add to that an immature learner. They have pretty bad social skills. They can't move around very well. They drool. They sleep for most of the day. And yet, somehow, these two things combined end up giving kids the keys to the city. They end up learning the language of their community despite their noisy environment and their immature state. So I think figuring out that puzzle will actually give us some pretty deep insight into the human mind. The second reason that I study infant word learning is that it really matters for a variety of health outcomes. So there are millions of children who have a variety of language delays and deficits, some of which I think we'll be hearing about from some of the other speakers. And the problem is that children are generally diagnosed with language and delays and deficits when they're late to start talking, which can be months or even years after they've begun to understand words. So if we can do a better job looking at word learning in the early stages, we can do a better job tagging those delays and deficits, which have knock-on effects for things like reading abilities and school success. Also, more broadly, understanding early word learning will help us understand parent-child interactions, which are important in particular for children growing up in poverty. And the more we understand about that process, the more we can improve outcomes for those children. So I study infant word learning because the science is fascinating and there are real implications for human health. So how do you measure early word comprehension? The way we do it in my lab is something like this. Babies come in, they sit in front of a computer screen. We put a couple pictures on the screen, and there's a little infrared camera that is measuring where their eyeballs are looking, and I'll show you a video of this in a second. And then they might hear something like, "Where's the apple?" and we see if they look at the apple. And that's a proxy for whether they know something about what that word means. So I'm going to show you a little video clip of eye movements from one 7-month-old on one trial. There will be a little counter in the corner that the babies didn't see, but the green dot is their pupil. Okay, that's the kind of data we get. So you can imagine that there are many trials, there are many babies, there are many kinds of displays. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we learned from studies like that. So we've learned that by 6 months, babies are already understanding something about what common nouns mean, words like mouth and apple. A little bit later, just a few months later, they're starting to understand more abstract words like uh-oh and all gone, which is interesting because while most hands look pretty similar, different instances of uh-oh can look pretty different. They're not quite experts yet, though, so over year 1, we've learned that they're still figuring out exactly how words sound, and over year 2, they're still figuring out some of the differences between confusable things like feet and socks. But we see that across the board, whatever kind of early learning they show, that around 14 months, they start to understand a lot better, and we have some ongoing work in my lab trying to figure out why that might be. So the other thing you can do, other than having babies come into the lab and test them, you can go to their house and see what their life is like, because that's what they're actually learning from. And so that's something that we're also doing in my lab. The way we do that is we get day-long audio recordings. Some of them are interesting, a lot of them are boring, of what babies are hearing all day. And then we also torture them by putting little cameras on their heads and seeing what they look at for an hour at a time. And we do this from the time they're 6 months old to the time they're 18 months old, so from the beginning of word comprehension to the beginning of word production, to try to put together what it is that they're learning. And so some highlights from that line of work include figuring out that when babies are hearing nouns at home, their input is actually quite consistent month to month, yet they're learning more from it. So it's not that the environment is changing as they grow, it's that their ability to make use of that data that's coming into their brains is increasing. We also find that if we show them pictures of their dog and their sippy cup, they do a little bit better and show comprehension a little bit earlier. And we also find that linguistic development is in lockstep with social development. So early on, if you are an early pointer, you have a bigger vocabulary. So gesture and linguistic development is tightly related, but everything's not related to everything. So just because you're a precocious walker doesn't mean that you're going to have a bigger vocabulary. And so the real take-home point from looking at the home environment in conjunction with what they know when they come into the lab is that despite the fact that my existence as a baby was super different from yours, we still ended up converging on the same lexicon despite this huge variability in our input. So the thought that I want to leave you with is that infant word learning really provides this window into cognition and development, and it does that because it's a deeply parallel process. And what I mean by that is that you don't just figure out what a given word means in a vacuum. You're figuring out, how do the sounds in my language work? How does social interaction in my life work? How do I categorize things? How do I shift my attention to whatever my caretaker's trying to tell me? And that all of those things are happening in parallel and cascading ways to inform us about how language develops. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
How many people just started to pitch for baby GoPros? Was it just me? Awesome. So we have time for a couple of questions for Dr. Bergelson. We will come here once again. Yeah, you need 2 hands for this one. All right. So here comes the. Now talk into the cue ball.
Okay, sorry. Your last point about how we come from divergent landscapes and end up at the same place. Can you talk a little bit more about that? That is fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that you and I can talk and understand each other kind of blows my mind if you think about it, given that our day-to-day experiences have been totally different. So I think the answer to that depends on sort of what granularity you look at. So there are going to be differences based on all sorts of features of your social life. Your socioeconomic status means that your life is going to be a little bit different, in some cases drastically different. But I think the magical piece of it all is that whatever that environment is like, whether you're growing up in the lowlands of Bolivia or in Cary, you still end up figuring out your community's language from the same kinds of signal over roughly the same time period. To me, that suggests there's a pretty big biological component to that learning process that needs to interact in complicated dynamic ways with that environment.
The language of Cary, very close to the language of Pittsburgh, I've learned. Okay, so over here, next question, heads up. Talk into it, into the black part. Speak into the ball, so we can all hear you.
Now that I need the ball, I taught school.
The people watching on TV need the ball.
Oh, sorry. All right. So, I was wondering, did you study only verbal language, or have you studied sign language? Because baby sign language is a thing, and have you done any comparison studies between the sign language and the verbal language?
Yeah, so sign language is definitely a really fascinating topic of study. Our lab doesn't study that. There are labs that study that. Full-blown sign language is fairly different from baby sign, and so we often have parents filling out checklists of words their kids know, and they want to include all of the signs they know. To some degree, that would be like giving you credit for knowing French if you know the word croissant. So I think that it depends on exactly what you're counting, but that sign language in general is super fascinating. Lots of people study it, not me.
Awesome. Now I know French. All right, next question over here.
Hello. Is this working? Okay. I was wondering if you'd studied anything related to how cultural differences might impact how babies learn language. I learned once in reading an article that some babies learn about relationships before they learn about nouns, whereas other babies learn about nouns first, and that's culturally based. Do you know anything about that?
I do. That's actually a kind of contested literature. There's a little bit of drama in our field around that idea. But I would say my take on it is that it turns out to be the case that cross-linguistically nouns come in first and are more dominant. There are certain languages that prioritize verbs, which sounds like a complicated thing that maybe we could talk more about. But there are definitely going to be cultural influences on language development, but those really early stages where you're first grasping on to the very first beginnings tend to be focused on concrete, tangible nouns.
I bet linguistic drama is, as my daughter says, lit. All right, last question over here.
So I learned 2 languages at once. What do you know, or what can you tell us about that whole process and what happens there?
Right.
So learning multiple languages at once.
Yeah. So the modal state of humanity is to learn more than one language at once. It's actually quite strange that we mostly study in our research labs monolingual, high socioeconomic status children, because that isn't the average citizen of the world. There's a ton of research, and ever expandingly so, on bilingualism. That there's also linguistic drama around that, because it turns out that it's only interesting to publish stuff that's surprising, and so all the ways that bilinguals might be the same as monolinguals don't get as much written about them. It's only when they're way better or way worse than you expect. But there are both parallels and divergences in those learning processes.
Awesome. Please give it up for Dr. Elika Bergelson.